Hi, my name is Mark Schwartz. I'm an enterprise strategist with AWS, and I'd like to talk a little bit about the relationship between CIOs and CFOs in the digital world. In my role at AWS, I meet with both CIOs and CFOs. Sometimes I say, and sometimes I think of the CFO as the hero of digital transformation. But when I think about it, maybe I also could say that the CIO is the hero of company financial performance these days. Let me start by telling you some of the questions that I hear a lot from CFOs when I talk to them. Often they want to know concretely what benefits the cloud will have for them, how they're going to measure those benefits. They want to know how they can have control over cloud spending when it seems like there are going to be people around the company who can commit the company to spending in the cloud. They would like to know, for example, what kinds of mistakes have other companies made when they went to the cloud. They want to know whether the cloud is secure often, how they should think about multi-cloud and vendor lock-in and issues like that. I think these are all great questions because they show that the CFO is taking their fiduciary duty to the company very seriously. It turns out that part of the answer, part of what I tell them is talk to your CIO. Really, a lot of the answers to those questions, as I'm going to try to show, depend on an ongoing conversation between the CIO and the CFO. So what kinds of questions do I hear from CIOs on their side? Well, one question is, how can I prepare a business case that's going to impress the CFO? Or maybe they're wondering about how can we find time for doing digital transformation when we're already so busy with just keeping the lights on and doing our everyday work? Sometimes they want to know how they can change the company's culture because a digital transformation often requires a lot more than just the technology side of things. It's the people changing the way that they think and the way that they act as well. And sometimes they're thinking about how to organize a change across the entire company in order to really get the benefits that are available from the cloud and from digital transformation. So again, I think these are great questions, and sometimes my answer just has to be work with the CFO. Actually, that's the best way to figure out how to deal with these challenges. So it's kind of an interesting situation, isn't it? Where the CIO and the CFO are really after the same things on behalf of their company. And in the past, the relationship has really been one of agreeing on a budget and maybe discussing budget execution. But the underlying question, the real question, I think, is how do you make the most of the technology in order to accomplish business results? And that's really a question for both of them to answer. So I want to start by talking a little bit about business cases for the cloud. And it's important to keep in mind that when we first created the cloud, it was really a way for us at AWS to offer computing and storage infrastructure, network infrastructure perhaps. The business case at that point was really about the cost of the infrastructure. The TCO, the cost to operate the infrastructure in a data center versus in the cloud. But that's really changed in a big way. It changed partly because the power of the cloud, we started to realize how much of a power the cloud had to help companies really change the way that they do business. It also changed because we at AWS innovated so many new services that we could offer in the cloud. So, for example, today in the cloud, you can access capabilities such as machine learning, edge computing, analytics, databases, virtual reality, augmented reality. This whole range of things that are often provided by IT organizations, or that IT organizations would like to provide. So the business case these days isn't really about the cost of the infrastructure. It's about how to use these available technologies and what kinds of business results you can expect from them versus the cost for acquiring them. It's hard to wrap your head around what that really means, because the business case for the cloud is, in a way, it includes all of IT. And even more so when you think about the future, because more and more capabilities are becoming available in the cloud. And I think that as new technologies emerge, they're not really going to emerge for data centers, they're going to emerge for use in the cloud. So in a way, the business case for the cloud is, starts to expand and become the business case for all of IT and all of technology within an organization. So I think this is one reason why it's challenging for CFOs and CIOs to discuss the business case of the cloud, because it's easy to just pinpoint the cost of infrastructure and how that changes when you move from a data center to the cloud. But that's not really the question. The question is the business case for how the company is going to be able to change with access to these new technologies versus the costs of those, the returns that they're going to get versus the costs. So the value of the cloud now is not just in reducing the cost of the infrastructure. Yes, that's a benefit, but in general, it's really not the biggest benefit. It might be the easiest one to pin down when you're trying to make a spreadsheet to analyze the costs, but I found that the business value that you get from the different way of doing infrastructure, the cost of that infrastructure is really a very small component of the business value that you would expect to get with the cloud. So what you have to do, first of all, is to broaden the discussion and to start thinking about how you're actually going to use the cloud, right? So the cloud hopefully is going to increase, you're going to use it in ways that will increase your security posture, increase your resilience. Often using the cloud is going to help you reduce costs in other parts of the business outside of IT, outside of the IT budget. For example, our customers who are in manufacturing, we see a lot of them using the cloud for predictive maintenance. So they can tell when components in the factory need maintenance, when they're likely to break down soon. Well, that impacts their cost for the maintenance, and it also impacts their ability to produce revenues because they're not going to have downtime while equipment fails. What's the value of the cloud? Well, it's not a question of infrastructure again. It's a question of how much it's going to save them in maintenance, how much it's going to prevent them losing revenues when the factory starts to have problems. And I think when you look at all the different offerings in the cloud, you can see that that's going to impact a very broad swathe of the company. And that's where the benefits are that you really want to look at. Now, sometimes I find CFOs are a little bit skeptical about this, and understandably so. One reason for that is they realize that the cloud all by itself is not going to provide these benefits, right? Just moving to the cloud isn't going to make that factory equipment better maintained, make it less likely to have downtime. It really depends on what you do with the cloud, how you use it. And they know that is going to depend on their company's execution, the skills of their people, and all of those kinds of things. And secondly, they're not so sure that they know how to measure those results because they're a little bit more indirect, from the cloud infrastructure itself. So the challenge in putting together the business case, I think, is to first make decisions about how you're going to use the cloud to create the business value, and then to work out the anticipated returns and the anticipated costs. Well, guess who's going to be central to making all that work? Of course, it's the CIO. So what I'm getting at is I can't help you make a business case for the cloud just in the abstract. Really, the business case for the cloud depends on a conversation between the CFO and the CIO, where they decide how they're going to use the cloud, what the most important objectives are for what they're going to do with it, and then they figure out the economics that are going to follow from that, with a commitment both on the part of the CIO and on the part of the CFO to do the things that will realize that business case. So the CIO will execute on the technology side, or have the IT organization execute, and the CFO will make sure resources are available when they're needed. And the two of them together will make that business case come true, essentially, will fulfill what is intended in the business case. So this leads to my answer on the question of how you measure results, right? It kind of follows directly. If you know what you're going to use the cloud for, at least your initial plan, and you've examined the business case for that, then you should be able to set up metrics that will tell you whether you're succeeding in accomplishing whatever it was that you wanted to accomplish. So for example, if your cloud business case is based on the idea that you're going to use machine learning to reduce fraud in payments that your company collects, well, your measurement of success is whether you're reducing fraud in those payments. If your business objective is something a little bit more technologically focused, for example, making sure IT systems are available more of the time, well, then availability is what you measure to see if you're being successful in your cloud transformation. And it's those metrics that you use to organize everybody's efforts. You want everybody working to maximize whatever that metric is. That is what you care about, and that's how you know if you're succeeding. You can think of the cloud as sort of a set of building blocks that we can offer you that you can use in different ways. The building blocks are a great way to execute IT initiatives to get value for the company. The value is partly in the acceleration they provide, faster time to market, benefits in cost, in security, in reliability. But again, it's the big benefit that you're really looking for, that you want to first examine the value of and then measure against. Well, that all depends on what the overall strategic objectives of the company are and how you map them into things that technology is going to help with. So one analogy that comes to mind is if you think about a hardware store, well, they have washers and bolts and things like that. What's the value of a washer? Well, I don't know. I can't really say. It depends on what you're going to use the washer for, and it's part of a bigger sense of value. So I think this is why sometimes those business cases are a little bit difficult to conceptualize. But when you start to examine all of those broad implications of working in the cloud, you'll see that this is really a powerful tool for business transformation. Another reason why it's sometimes difficult to conceptualize the business value of the cloud is that it sometimes involves things that are a little bit more abstract, you might say. For example, there's agility and there's resilience. And these are things that obviously have a lot of business value. Agility is a great thing for you. Resilience, of course, is important. But they're a little bit more difficult to measure and put into a business case. So if you think about measuring the value of agility, for example, well, you can't quite project returns on that, because the point of agility is that you're going to be able to do things that come up that you don't know about today. Agility, I like to say, is your ability to respond to changes in your environment quickly, at low cost, at low risk, and creatively to create opportunities or respond to threats. Well, with that definition of agility, working in the cloud is going to get you a lot of that. and it's going to have business value. But by definition, you don't know how you're going to use your agility. And so measuring it is a little more difficult. Thinking about resilience, I look at our AWS customers facing COVID, facing the pandemic and its consequences. Well, the ones who are AWS customers in general were able to scale up if their business happened to benefit during the pandemic or have the ability to grow, or scale down and do so quickly and save money and be more liquid, have more cash available for other things, again, if they were in the cloud, because it lends itself to that kind of resilience. So it's important, more important now that we've seen the COVID pandemic in action and how companies had to respond to it. But it's a little bit more difficult to measure and put into your business plan. Think about things like environmental sustainability. So we know that on the average, moving workloads to the cloud reduces their carbon footprint by 88%. That's big. But how are you going to factor that in versus the cost of the servers? And I think I've made my point. I hope so. So in the end, this is what business cases are really about when you're thinking about the cloud. And you'll notice that all of these things that I've talked about have to do with the way the technology organization actually executes when they're using the cloud, how it uses the cloud, how it works with the rest of the business to define objectives and create ways of adding business value through the cloud. And it also requires that the CFO be making sure that the company's resources are available for it to be able to make all these uses of the cloud and get that business value. So I said another question that comes up a lot is, how do you control spending in the cloud or in the digital world in general, really, which is going to be much more fast-paced. It's going to involve a lot more decentralized, autonomous, empowered teams. Well, the answer is that you control costs through a deep partnership between the CIO and the CFO. The cloud gives you so many opportunities to manage your costs. And as a result, it pays to actually have people who are dedicated to managing costs in the cloud. That might seem like a little bit of a burden, but it isn't really. When you think about it, it's more a question of how many levers are available to you to reduce costs. Where if you were putting equipment into a data center, you'd have this depreciation each year that comes from your original fixed cost. And you wouldn't really have control over how much of an expense you were going to have each year after you'd bought the original equipment. In the cloud, there are so many different things that you can do to manage costs. I'll give you an example. For us, I used to be the CIO at US Citizenship and Immigration Services before I joined AWS. So we realized pretty quickly that our software developers were working, they work hard, but let's say 8 hours a day, 10 hours a day, or something like that. Well, that meant that there was no need to keep the servers that they were using on 24 hours a day. So we arranged it so those were automatically turned off after the developers finished work and went home. They could be turned on again if necessary. But if the server is on for 8 hours and then off for 16 hours, you've saved 2/3 of the cost right there. There are plenty of other ways. And the discipline of managing your costs on a continuing basis like this is something that's often called Finops. We sometimes refer to it as cost optimization. But the idea is to have transparency into spending, deep transparency, and then for the CIO and the CFO to be working together to find opportunities for managing costs. And sometimes there's a trade-off. It might be possible that the software developers, let's say, or the technologists can find ways to lower operational costs by making certain changes to the code, let's say. But making those changes to the code maybe costs something upfront. So this is a business decision, and it's the kind of decision that you want collaboration between the finance organization and the technology organization. So with all of these different tools that you can use, one of the really powerful ones, I think, is the ability to get transparency into spending. Because in the cloud, well, you get invoiced for what you use in the cloud, and so you can see what's costing you money. But even more than that, we have this magical thing called tagging, resource tagging, which lets you identify for each cloud resource that you use and that you pay for. You can put any identifying information with it that you need. So, for example, you can tag it with your business unit that's using it, with the project, with the team that's working on it, with which value stream it's part of. All of those different things, you can tag it with all of those things if they're interesting to you, and then you can report on your costs based on those tags. This is so powerful for Finops or for cost optimization because you can see where the costs are, and then you can assign responsibility and accountability to the teams that are incurring those costs to try to find ways to reduce them. It also sometimes can help you get better insight into your unit economics. You can see for each type of transaction how much you're spending in cloud resources, and then manage your costs, your cost of goods sold, your margins based on that, and decide where you want to put more effort into reducing your unit costs, for example. In the cloud, this becomes extra interesting. This is actually true of the digital world in general, is that a lot of things that were fixed costs before are now becoming variable costs. And so you can actually look at them on a unit economics basis and see which of your transactions are more valuable to you. Most commercial organizations that I talk to have plans to grow. And that makes sense because capital markets seem to value growth quite a lot. You really need to have a growth story in at least in a lot of company situations. Growing might involve innovating new products. It might involve entering new markets. There are different ways to do it, but in general, innovating and entering new markets and doing things that are going to help you grow are risky, somewhat risky. If you're innovating a new product, you don't know if it's going to have the impact that you expect. You don't know if the market is going to love it as much as you think they're going to love it. The cloud, this is really where the cloud excels in its ability to let you try ideas, try innovative ideas or extensions or new geographies, and commit a smaller amount of resources until you see whether the innovation is going to be effective, and take feedback from the market and fine-tune the innovation based on what you see. I wanted to give you an example from my history, from when I was at U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. A quick little story for you. We had a very big project, one of these government projects that you read about in the newspapers, and it was a project where we'd spent about $1 billion, $1 billion, and we didn't really have that much to show for it. And at some point, the project came to me. It had been managed outside of our IT organization, but at some point I became responsible for it. And so the first thing I did was I sat down with the leaders of the project and I asked them, I sat down with them individually. I asked them, what could we be doing differently that maybe would lead to a better result? And they gave me great answers, very innovative answers. One of them said, we're just taking what was a paper process and making it electronic without really making changes to it. Instead, we could do this, this, and this, and we get a better result. Somebody else said, well, we're not really listening to the people who are going to be using this IT system. If we were listening to them, they would like this thing, this thing, this thing. And she gave me a bunch of great ideas, all of which I thought were quite innovative. And so, of course, I asked them, why haven't you been doing these things? You've been leading the project. And they said, do you realize how hard it is to get approval for any new idea? There are so many people who can veto any idea. We have to present to this board of 19 people and, get approvals. And by the way, Mark, you're one of those people who gets in the way. That made me think a lot. And I realized this is something that we do. Innovation is risky. And so we often say things like, well, how do you know that's going to work? And did you check with this person and this person? And, we as soon as we hear an innovative idea, we tend to think of the reasons why it won't work. There's a reason why we do that. It's to protect the company from risk. But what we can do in the cloud instead is we can let more ideas get to execution, to where they're tried out at a small, nimble scale until they can prove themselves. It's sort of like venture capital investing, where you invest in stages. There's a Series A and a Series B and a Series C. Each time you put more money in, you've mitigated more and more of the risk, so you know that you've got a good investment. And from my experience, this is really the difficulty with innovation. It's not that people in the organization don't have good ideas. They almost always do, especially the ones who are working most directly with customers. The challenge is always in accepting those ideas as being worthy of experimenting with, trying to get them to market in some form, or at least to let them prove themselves out. And with the cloud, one of the big values that you can get is this ability to try things out at low cost at first, because it's a small market, right? In the cloud, it's pay as you go. So as your volume increases and your revenue increases, well, your costs go up correspondingly. But when you're trying out new ideas, you're not paying those higher costs. This is very powerful. And again, it has to do with the value that you can get out of the cloud. But the thing is, it's a matter of executing right? It's innovation doesn't just go up because you're working in the cloud. It goes up when the technologists start to use the cloud in this way that empowers innovation, when the CFO is willing to invest experimental funds or upfront funds or developmental funds to be able to do these sorts of prototypes, and then to evolve the funding and the business model as you learn from those experiments. So once again, I'm talking about the CIO and the CFO working together in order to actually capture value. I want to touch on just one more topic, and that's the question of security in the cloud. Is the cloud secure? When I was the CIO at USCIS, I made the case for moving to the cloud to the CISO of Homeland Security. That was our parent organization. And of course, that question came up: is the cloud secure? Well, it is, I will tell you. But it's not really the right question, in a sense. The right question is, compared to the data center that you're in now and your ability to create a good security posture there, will the cloud let you create a better security posture? And the answer is it will. The cloud infrastructure itself and the tools that you can use in the cloud that you don't have access to in your data center, if you are good at security, if the technologists know how to use it, then you can formulate a much more powerful security posture in the cloud because you have the benefit of those additional capabilities. So once again, it's a question of collaboration, defining your objectives, deciding how you're going to invest, but also executing in a way that makes use of these opportunities in the cloud. Or if you see where I'm going with this, again, it's about finance and technology working together. So to summarize, CFOs, how do you control spending in the cloud? Well, you work with the CIO to set up automated controls, transparency, team accountability for their costs. How do you know what benefits you'll gain in the cloud? And how will you measure them? Well, you work with the CIO, I think, to decide what benefits you're looking for. to make a plan for them, and then to set up measures for those benefits and execute against them. What are the risks of the cloud? Well, you should talk to your CIO about how the technologists intend to use the cloud to improve security posture, to be able to make innovation less risky, and things like that. CIOs, well, how do you convince the CFO of the business case? Well, you do it by working with the CFO to identify company objectives and map them into things that you can do in the cloud, and make the business case for the value of those things that you can do, and then figure out how you're going to execute against them. How do you make time for transformation when you're so busy with other things? Well, I think you work with the CFO to determine priorities, let's say. You work with the rest of the CXO team as well to figure out what the company's strategic objectives are, and you map them into how the technology organization is going to help, and then that becomes your priority by definition. And often, to accomplish these priorities in a fast-changing environment, you're going to need to be in the cloud, or you're going to get a lot of power by being in the cloud. And that's going to help you figure out how to prioritize and how to make time for these things. So what the bottom line is that the CIO and the CFO together are the partners who turn a company digital. They are the heroes both of the digital world and of financial performance in companies going forward into the future, which is so much about the digital world. So I want to leave you with that. You joined this summit to learn some things, and you can keep learning beyond the event. You can use our AWS Training and Certification and the resources that we offer for you and your team to transform your business. 451 research found that 90% of IT decision makers identified a gap between their team's skill levels and the knowledge that's required to reach their cloud business goals. AWS Training and Certification can help your business accelerate growth and increase agility by building cloud fluency across the entire organization. We offer resources you need to develop and attract cloud talent, create adaptable and continuous learning mechanisms, and modernize your organization at scale. To achieve this, we have virtual classroom training, including private training, which can be supplemented by hundreds of free digital courses. We offer AWS certifications to validate expertise for new and existing talent and motivate them to build new skills. And we have a growing collection of references, resources to help you build your employer brand and implement comprehensive training programs. We at AWS are also committed to preparing the next generation for the future of work. We have programs like the AWS Academy and AWS Restart, and we're using them to help students pursue in-demand cloud roles. For more information, please visit aws.training. Please visit AWS Training/Enterprise and see what else we have available. So thank you very much for listening, and please do remember to complete the session survey. This helps us a lot. We value your feedback. Thank you.